pleasure of telling Michael Lee Ray's a Corkman. And obviously that went down very well with Michael. He was a good sport about it, and he actually does have Cork roots way back. So, to give you a little bit of overview of Ancestry, because I've often gone into places and people have assumed that I'm American because I work with Ancestry for a start. But one of the things we're actually quite proud of in our office is we're actually the largest genealogy employer in Ireland. We have over 90 people working in our offices in Dublin, including 6 on-staff professional genealogists, plus other people who work in all aspects of it, working with archives to make sure we can get Irish records out amongst others. We're actually responsible for everything outside the US. So we have a lot of people working in that office that are very much passionate about genealogy as well. So it makes it for a very fun place to work for any of us who are into genealogy. So, sort of going through what I'm going to talk about today is DNA. And DNA is a little bit of a sideways view of genealogy for anybody like myself who's been doing genealogy for a long time. And it takes a step back to think about how you best use it in your own genealogical research and how you can use it. But it's also something that is evolving at an unbelievable pace. To put it in perspective, that squiggle of letters you actually see behind you there, that's my actual DNA there. That's my very own DNA readout. Now, 14 years ago, 25th of April 2003, the first human genome was published. That was where scientists went and they read somebody's DNA. And that cost $3 billion to do. It works out about $1 a letter. And nowadays you can get a DNA test done for under €100, and if it's a sale time, it's as low as 49 or 59 euros. So in the space of the 14 years, it's gone from 3 billion to, you know, the price of a birthday present or a Christmas present. So it's made it accessible for everyone. It's also changed how we do it, and it changed how we think. So because it is a step, I always start with what I know. And it's what, when I'm speaking with a genealogical society, it's what we know, which is records. And this is how we traditionally do genealogy. And I can remember very, very clearly the first time I held a census record. And I've been doing it long enough that I remember they used to come around and they hand you the box with the whole townland in it. And you just leaf through, and a porter actually said, just don't write them. And that was 30 odd years ago, where I used to go as a school kid for school project, looking through my family history. And that census document that you can now get online at the touch of a button, you went into the forecourt or looking at the Bishop Street, then it was. And you would request this document, you'd look through. And this is my great-great-grandfather, Tom Logue, and my great-great-great-grandfather, I should say. And these are some of the documents he's left behind. There's petty sessions, there is birth, marriage, death records, there's census records. They're the things we know as genealogists to look for. And then when we come to DNA, we're kind of thrown for a loop because we don't see documents. But what I tell people is to think of DNA as another type of document. In fact, it's the most fundamental document we will ever have in our family, because it is, the DNA is little bits of molecules inside the cells in your body, and everybody has DNA, and the best way to think of it, it's a blueprint for life. It contains the instructions to make sure that you have 2 hands, 2 legs, but it also contains every little bit that makes you unique, makes you you. But the other way that this DNA is different is you get 50% of it from your mother and 50% from your father. And they in turn get it from their parents, your grandparents. You get on average 25%. And if you do the math, every generation on average will have. So what it means is that the DNA becomes a document that's handed down from generation to generation. So although I often think of my DNA as my DNA, I'm really just a custodian of the DNA that has come from my family. Half of it has come from the mother's side of my family, and half of it has come from my father's side. So it's just a document inside of me. And what science is doing now is it's getting the ability to read this document. And some of the bits of the document are faded and old and thousands of years old and they're hard to read, and some are more recent. But as the science learns to read it, and we as genealogists learn to interpret what they're telling us, we can look for the signatures of our ancestors in our DNA. And this diagram here kind of shows how this works, and kind of from me to Tom. That I have 3 or 4 generations going back from me to Tom, but I've actually done a descendancy tree for Tom as well, and he has somewhere in the region of 450 odd living descendants that I've tracked down so far. And each one of the 450 of us share some of Tom's DNA. And it's that simple shared piece of DNA that's the heart of what all DNA analysis is all about, particularly this autosomal DNA that I'm talking about here. So I share with my sister somewhere quite a bit, you know, not as quite as much as my parents, but thereabouts. But if I go back to my first cousin, I'll share a bit less. Second cousin, a little less again, and a third cousin. And it's a mathematically predictable amount that we share with people. So by judging the amount of DNA we share with our cousins, we can work backwards to work out how far back it came from. And with a bit of old-fashioned genealogical legwork, you can actually work out where it came from as well. And so that's the science behind it. And I'm not going to talk about the science much beyond this, because the science enables us to do work as genealogists, but it's not required reading if you want to do it as practice. So from our side, what do we do? Well, what we do is we go on to webs like Ancestry.ie or some of the other companies that do DNA tests. So you go on to Ancestry.ie, you order a DNA testing kit. And what you get sent in the post is a test tube. It's about yay big, and actually inside it there's a false bottom. So what you have to fill is about a half teaspoonful of spit, because your saliva contains lots of DNA. And you send that back to our labs, and we will analyze it, and our science team will read the DNA, and they will give you a set of analysis looking at different pieces of DNA at different time frames. So you can think of some of the DNA we look at looks at the very distant past, some of it looks at the more recent past. And what I'm going to go through is the 3 types of analysis we do in Ancestry, which are pretty standard as you would see now in a DNA test today, to give you an idea of how you would use it and what you can use it for. So if we start with the distant past, we use the term ethnicity estimates when we're talking about the distant past. The more technical term that's often used for this type of test is an admixture test. It's the one that gets all the press with DNA testing. It's the one that people refer to as the pie chart. It tells you how Irish you are or how British you are. And people can get very hot up about those terms because we're using modern day labels for something that's thousands of years ago when you didn't have the idea of Irish or British. So the best labels we have, and whatever labels we choose, we're always going to have that's confusing. So they're the ones we can actually name most of the people today, so we use them. But if I talk you how these estimates are produced, it might give you a better idea of why those labels come to be. So I'm going to start with what we call a reference panel. And the work here that we've done in Ancestry follows on from some pioneering work done almost 10 years ago now by Professor November in America, where he looked at the DNA of different groups of people that he knew were from different parts of the world, and he saw that the DNA was slightly different. Now, people sometimes get very sort of saying, oh, this shows that there's different beings across the world. It's not, these are tiny differences we're talking about. It's almost as if you had a slightly different sentence order in the middle of Ulysses by James Joyce. You're never going to know unless you really know to look. These are tiny, tiny differences in our DNA. For example, we have about 99.9% DNA shared by everybody in this room and everybody on the planet. But in that small piece it's different. There are bits that are different due to population dynamics and how populations have moved all over the world. And if you can isolate populations, that is, find people who have been in a certain part of the world for a long period of time, you can look for those slight differences and then compare the rest of us to those slight differences. And this is what we talk about when we talk about our reference panel. We went around the world and we gathered up somewhere in the region of 4,500 DNA samples from individuals for whom we had validated their genealogy in advance. So the guy with the cap there is from Ireland. His particular gentleman, his family tree had been done back 6, 7 generations, as far as the paper records effectively can get you in Ireland. And it showed that his family was from the west of Ireland that whole way back. That meant we had a confidence that his DNA probably had been in Ireland a very long time. There's another one up at the top. It's a group in Mongolia where they actually record the family history of the village on a stone in the centre of the village, and they carve on little bits of the family history. But when we went there, we took the DNA of people there. So we took that 4,500 people, and we ran it through quality control to check was, well, their genealogy says they're from here. We all know genealogies can have mistakes. So what if we compared them to the other people who say they're from here? So we can kind of weed out the ones that are lower quality, and we were left with 3,000 people around the world who we had very strong confidence that these group of people, their DNA has stayed in this part of the world for a long time. And when we took these 3,000 people, it broke into 26 regions around the world. And these are the regions, some are Africa, America, quite a few in Europe, and quite a few around the Pacific as well, and in West Asia. And what it was is the 3,000 people who were separated we looked at their DNA, we saw that their DNA had little bits, little patterns that we could look for in other people to see how much you have a relationship to these group of people. So when you take your spit test, the first test that we run through we call the ethnicity estimate, and it comes back with a result that looks something like this. This is the ethnicity estimate result for my father. My dad is from Dundrum, he's from just up the road, so he's a Dublin guy. And his heritage is predominantly Leinster. His four-grandparents are Meath, Kildare, Dublin, Wexford. So he has a pretty strong Leinster trace to his heritage from his family tree. But he also has then, what does his DNA look like? And if you look at his DNA, it tells you that he's predominantly Irish. It's a 78% Irish estimate. And what that means is his DNA compared to the reference panel of Irish people comes out with a figure of around 78%. We're also picking up other signals in there. We're picking up some Scandinavian. We're picking up some British. But what does that mean? Does it mean that he has Viking and Brits in his family history? Possible. It's an estimate based on us comparing you to living people today. What you have to do then as a genealogist is interpret that data. And the way we would interpret that is we interpret it with the known history we have. I know, for example, that in my family there are some British lines. That would explain the British estimate. And I know as well that there are some lines with some Viking surnames. Could that explain the Scandinavian estimate? Potentially. So this is the first estimate. What we're looking at is an estimate looking at your DNA that goes back maybe 1,000, 1,500 years ago. You know, so it's a long time away. There's a lot of population dynamics happening between now and then. But it gives, for a lot of people, a great introduction to genealogy. And we found that this has been, for Ancestry, a very interesting way to get people interested in asking the question, who am I, where did I come from? The questions we ask as genealogists regularly. But they start with this very simple picture. This tells me a figure of who I am. And you can imagine if you're an American taking this test, it's sort of giving you an impression of where your European or your African ancestors came from. If you're a British person, you have as well. What we see, for example, in Great Britain is we see a predominance of higher levels of Scandinavian over on the East Coast. We see very strong levels of Irish over on the West Coast. In fact, one of the difficulties in interpreting this test is the genetics between Irish, Welsh, Scottish especially is extremely close. So if you're Scottish, very often you'll get a high Irish estimate. People have often said to me, doesn't that mean it's really a Celtic signal that we're finding in the DNA? And I wouldn't argue against that, but Celtic comes with its own baggage as well. But what we do know is in the past 1,500 years, there's been a lot of Irish people have ended up in Scotland, a lot of Scottish people have ended up in Ireland back and forth. We've traded genes. Now what we normally would call trading genes is like having families, but in the DNA world it's trading genes. Like I know my own grandfather spent like 10 years in Paisley. So we do know there's been a lot of back and forth. You don't need any great invasions to explain the genetic signature going back 1,500 years. The next test looks at the more recent past, and this is one that is it's an extremely new type of test. It's only available in the last 2 months. It's kind of a new style of test that Ancestry have introduced. We're the only people who have this. And we were looking at the types of tests we have at Ancestry about a few years ago. And what we knew was that DNA was very good for those distant tests, what we call the ethnicity estimate, looking back thousands of years. And we also knew that, which is the one I'll come on to next, it was also very good at looking at the very, very close past, 4, 6, 7 generations back, with cousin matching, which is another type of test. There was this big gap in the middle, where we had a lot of people asking a lot of questions. Now, if you take the last diagram I showed you, which showed the ethnicity estimate of my dad, saying he's a bit Scandinavian, he's a bit British, he's mostly Irish. A lot of people ask, well, how do I take the next step? I'm interested here. How do I break that down even further? How do I understand more detail where I came from, who I came from? The type of questions we often start out with. And that's where we came up with this idea of genetic communities. And it's a very different way of analysing DNA, so I'll kind of walk through how we did it. But it starts with this idea. We have 4 million people in our database right now, so 4 million people around the world have taken the test. And some of those people, you'll match some of them. If you take the test, you'll get a lot of matches. In fact, you'll get thousands of matches, more than most people anticipate. But you're not equally related to everyone. You will have some people in this database who you're first cousins with. You'll have some people who you're fifth cousin with. And that's what that diagram here is. You have people that relate to you in different ways. But those people are also related to other people. So they may be your fourth cousin, but their first cousin in the database on the other side of the family who you've no relation with. So our 4 million people are joined together in what we call a genetic network, which is a network spanning the globe of DNA shared by the 4 million people. And when you look at that from a big systems level, like our data scientists do, you end up getting a picture that looks like this. The picture on the left is a bigger version of the picture on the previous slide. On the previous slide I showed one person with 6 cousins. On this slide, that ball on the left, if you could count, there's actually 75 people in that small genetic network. Now our scientists have developed algorithms that can take that ball, take the 75 and look through and find out there are little clusters inside it. People who, for whatever reason, seem to be more genealogically closely related than other people. So one way of thinking of it, imagine myself and my family were one part of the 75 and somebody all the way over on the other side of America was another group. We'd have 2 little clusters around my family and their family. So when they run the algorithm on this particular 75 people, this was a test set that we had when we were developing the science, they found 3 clusters. They were shown in green, orange and blue. And you'll see there's some overlap. There's particularly a person in orange there who seems to be at the centre of 2 of these clusters. You know? And one way to think of it is, imagine this orange person, the green represents a cluster on the mother's side and the orange on their father's side. This is how these clusters overlap. So it's not, here's a cluster and they're not related to anybody else. We all know that genes mix and flow over time. So this cluster analysis allowed us to try and do something different and look at that middle ground of the last 200 to 500 years and try and figure out, are there these clusters in our database and what do they mean? So we did a process where we wanted to identify what we call genetic communities. And there was a couple of stages to the process. The first process is we went through the people in the database to find how many clusters are there. And at the time when we first ran this analysis, we found about 300 clusters. That were very solid clusters that we could stand by. That's growing all the time. When we did the first analysis of clustering, we had a million people in the database. So out of a million, we found 300 communities. But all that told us was, here's a group of people in our network who are related to each other. We don't know anything about what that means. It's just a group of people, and some are first cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. How do we find out what this community is and what it might represent? So the second step is we started to say, what do we know about the people in this cluster? Well, we know, for example, what their ethnicity estimate is, which is the first test I told you. And in this particular example of this cluster, we found that a lot of the people, in fact, the majority of this people in this cluster had above Irish estimate in their ethnicity estimate. So we know what the average is for the whole 4 million, and these people were predominantly, you can see the ethnicity estimate, the pie chart for them, they show a very strong link to Ireland. So our first clue is, we can take a good guess that this cluster came from or is associated with Ireland. So the next piece of analysis we did was we looked at all of the family trees of people on Ancestry who are in this cluster. So if we have a cluster of maybe 100,000 people and maybe 60,000 of them have trees, we can look at those trees for different clues as to what might identify the cluster. And one of the first things we did is we looked at all the surnames that are in the cluster, in the trees in the cluster, and is there any of those that seem to stick out like a sore thumb, that are statistically significant? And when we looked through this particular example, we found names like Sullivan, McCarthy, Murphy. Now this is where I was able to get one over on my scientific friends, because I could tell them I know where that's going before they did the rest of their analysis. Because the next step in their analysis, we have all these trees, we have all these surnames. Are there any birth locations that are relevant? And so they started to look at the birth locations, and sure enough, this picture here shows there's orange dots and red dots. So what the orange and red dots was the amount of people with birth locations in these places. And sure enough, the communities seem to emerge in a certain part of Ireland and a certain part of Munster. There's another analysis which I actually haven't got with me today, in that when you do the test, we also looked at the birth locations of parents versus birth locations of children. So it allows us to find out how the cluster migrated. So we were able to see migration patterns from Munster to Australia to America. One of my favourite ones is we see this spike of migration in this Munster cluster around 1849 to San Francisco to the gold rush. So we were able to see this spike of migration around the gold rush time to San Francisco from people in Munster We were also able to see a spike drop in Australia around 1870, 1875, when the convict ships stopped sailing to Australia. So we were able to see the history just in the genetics. And at this point in time, we haven't actually plugged anyone into these clusters, we've just identified them. So this particular example is one of the 300 clusters that we identified, and this particular one happened to be in Ulster. Now, what it looks like for the UK and Ireland is we have identified 31 communities in the UK and Ireland. So there's roughly 16 or so in Ireland and 15 or so in the UK. Part of the reason why, particularly in the early analysis we did, it's weighted to Ireland, is the cluster also gets a contribution from everybody who takes the test, regardless of where they're born. You don't have to be born in Ireland to be in a cluster. And many of the members of the clusters for Ireland are actually US first generation, second generation Irish. They still have genetic links to those countries they came from. And one part of the analysis, we have a paper we submitted to Nature, came out at the start of the year, actually showed that there are certain different patterns of migration we were able to see. So for example, when the Irish went to America, we stayed amongst their own, we married amongst their own, with some unusual little exceptions along the way. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but in my own cluster, for example, one of the surnames we found cropped up a lot. My cluster is Donegal, but one of the surnames we saw cropped up a lot was Lombardo. And we asked the science team to check it out because I don't know many Lombardos from up in Donegal. And it turns out the reason that surname popped out in this cluster is because when the Irish got to New York and the Italians got to New York, they created almost like a Catholic cluster in around New York, which meant that some Italian names showed up in some Irish clusters. So it was one of those cases where it's showing you not only where your genes came from, but where they went to. So when we dig into the Irish ones, we found 3 broad regions of Ireland. And I was one of the people who came up with the name, and I got a lot of stick for this because I named them Ulster, Connacht and Munster, and you'll see Munster kind of stretches up a little bit towards Dublin. But when we do the analysis of surnames, another piece of analysis on the cluster, we actually see that they are Munster-based clusters. And I can talk you through the Ulster cluster, what we found. What we found was there was 5 genetic communities in the region of Ulster, and we had a pretty hard time because this is one of those cases where the science team presents challenges to us as genealogists and historians. And this group of people is here. Can you tell us why they're here? And I'll stand up for this because I'm in the Ulster region, so I have a little more knowledge of it. But my own cluster that I got assigned to, so just to talk how you get assigned, when you take the test, one of the results that come back at that, it'll tell you whether you're assigned to any genetic community. And it doesn't need your tree to work this out, it's just using your DNA. So as a blind test, I gave the science team my DNA as a test, and they came back and said, Mike, you're associated with the Donegal Southwest cluster. Well, actually, they didn't call it Donegal Southwest. They said, you're associated with a cluster here, Mike, what's it called? And I said, it's Donegal Southwest. But to me, even though I know I'm from there, I grew up in Donegal, so it's not a surprise to me. But it's pretty amazing that my genetics can tell this part to this particular region. And in fact, it's a bit hard to make out in the overview map, which we have of all of them, but when you actually see the Donegal Southwest cluster on there, you can actually see the blue stacks as essentially a shadow where there's nobody born. And there's a few people born north of the blue stacks, but most of us are kind of south of the blue stacks. And anybody who knows the local history back home, somebody coming over the mountain was very much a blow-in for generations. It didn't happen too much. So that shows up in the genetics, and that's how these clusters form, because what happens, if you think, I gave you the science explanation, but if you think of the historical and the genealogical explanation, we know people tend to marry local for most of history. You know, if there was a mountain one side of you and the sea in the other, you tend to marry in that strip of land. Or if there's a river running by, people tended to marry on one side of the river unless there was a bridge. And that's how these clusters formed. And in some cases, the cluster also forms by religion or status. There's one cluster in Sicily that I find is amazing. There's actually 5 clusters in the same exact location. But when we've done the analysis, as far as we can tell, it's 5 separate families who had nothing to do with each other and just swore they would never marry each other. And they've ended up forming their own clusters. But back to Ulster. So we have 5 here. 4 make a lot of sense. Oddly enough, there's 3 in Donegal, and that's nothing to do with me, it just happened that way. There's Donegal Southwest, Donegal East, and there's the Inishowen Peninsula in Derry. And what they are 3 genetically distinct groups of people that we can identify just in the genetics alone. We have another one which we call Ulster East, which again, and I'll come back to Ulster East in a little while, it does stretch down to Dublin, which so far is not Ulster despite our best efforts. But we then have this one. This is one of my favourites. This, we didn't know what to call this stretch. We came up with North Midlands, which is appropriately generic and not going to get us into trouble. But this is suspiciously like Breffni to me. And anybody who I've shown this to said, why didn't you call it Breffni? I said, I'm not that brave. But it is, and in fact, when you look at the names associated with this cluster, you get a lot of Rileys, you get McKennas, and you get people like that. So the clusters do indicate, in some cases, that there's possibly, if we do more work, that it's indicating genetics that possibly goes back more than 200 or 300 years, potentially 600, 700 years ago. And it to do partially with the mobility of the people. The other thing we did, and I'll sit back down, as well as finding locations, we also find surnames that pop up more often in these communities. Gallagher, O'Donnell, Boyle, McLaughlin, and so forth. And a lot of those are recognisably northern names. So we do see that the surnames, definitely for Irish people, less so in other communities, but definitely for Irish people, the surnames are indicators of where you came from as well. And one of the really nice things for me since we launched communities, just at the start of March we launched communities, I've had a lot of people joining our Donegal Facebook group saying, Genetic Communities has identified me as coming from Donegal. All I knew is that my Irish ancestor came from Ireland. I didn't know. I'm here to learn where in Donegal came. And his name's like Charles Sweeney. And I said, well, we could have told you that if you'd known that there was Sweeney. So it's one of those things where Irish surnames often tell you where you came from, but Genetic Communities is telling those people who aren't so au fait with Irish surnames. So it's great to see. Moving on to Connacht, we've identified 6 here, and Connacht is, as you can see, a real seething hotbed of communities. It's hard to make them out individually, but there are actually 5 there. One of the clearest ones is Connemara, coming around here. We have Mayo Galway, and then we have Mayo Sligo. Now, my Connacht geography is not as good as my Ulster geography, but there is mountain ranges there that kind of skew the communities and cause them to form. We also have one that is North Connacht, which brings in this kind of region here. So we have 5 communities there, and we find that those communities are very, very tightly packed. They're very, how would I put this? The term we often use is endogamous communities. They're communities that are a lot of intermarriage, a lot of people are double cousins. It forms very tight communities. And the surnames that come up here, you'll see McDonough, you'll see Flaherty, Connolly, Costello, names you associate with Connacht. And then Munster. Munster has, again, 5 communities. We have one Limerick and Kerry. We have one which is Kerry, one Cork, one which is West Cork. So we've one for Cork and one for West Cork. So they get 2 for Cork. And then we have this thing called Southern Ireland. And Southern Ireland is a bit of a, we're not 100% sure on that one. We call it Southern Ireland. I think we might rename it when we get a bit more data. And this is what communities continually present us. Where we started with 300 communities, we're getting new communities essentially on a weekly basis. And there's almost a race for us on the history and the genealogy side to keep up with the science. Why is this community what it is? What's the right name for it? We ended up calling it Southern Ireland out of just sheer, well, we don't know. But the surnames again here, O'Brien, McCarthy, Ryan, Sullivan. Again, very much Munster surname. Where's Leinster? Because this is the one I wanted to return to. So we didn't find a Leinster region, per se. And there's a lot of theories we have for that. We don't have an answer, I would say. We have some theories, and I think time will tell us, and as the science advances, we will find out more, I think. One of the theories, which I think there's an element to it, is the database has been in the US since about 2012. It's been in Ireland since 2015, been in the UK since 2015. If you look at Leinster, historically, you don't get as much migration to the US as you do the other regions. So there's more Americans kind of giving us more data to create the other clusters. Also, Leinster has a lot more mobility. One of the things that helps clusters to form is if the people stay put and marry each other. Leinster people tended to be more mobile. There was more people coming into Leinster from outside of the region. There were more people moving around Leinster. So that's another theory that we have. Again, the data we do think communities will form, it'll just take more data. But the other one that we're also looking at, these are two communities. This one is Southern Ireland and this one is Ulster East. Now when we look at the names, the surnames that are associated with these communities, like in this community you're still seeing Sullivans and Ryans and O'Briens. In this you're still seeing O'Neills and Gallaghers. So we're fairly confident that this is an Ulster community and this is a Munster community. But obviously between them they cover most of Leinster. So the other theory that we have here is that there's a potential that we're actually picking up some internal migration inside Ireland. So what you might be seeing is people moving towards Dublin for work, or the other side moving towards Dublin for work. And what they're doing is, and it's not like suddenly they pack their bags and everybody goes to Dublin and that draws them out. It might be one generation where, you know, the son or the daughter moves, 30 miles east, and they start a family, moves another 30 miles east. So we do think there's a possibility that internal migration is behind some of it. So what we have here in this test, and this is one that gets a lot of people excited, is the distant past and learning you're 90% Irish or 95% Irish. It's an interesting starter for a genealogist. If you're just starting out as being a genealogist, it's kind of a gateway into the wider world of genealogy. But this test starts to give you some much more concrete answers. For example, if you're starting out and you're just looking at a couple of names and you don't know where to start, this is already telling you that, hey, these are archives you should be looking at, or these are parish registers you should be looking at. If you have a surname in your family and you've hit a brick wall, already you can think, well, I've got a Southwest Donegal cluster here, maybe I should be looking at the parish records. It's a bad example, we've hardly any parish records, but other parts of the world of Ireland where you do have good parish records, that may be where you should do your searching. So this starts to become a very useful tool for a genealogist, and not just for people who are wondering about their sense of identity. So that's why we're very proud of where we are with the communities. But it also starts people thinking about the next question. The next question, in the context of the three tests that you get when you do it, the three results you get when you do a test. The first result, the distant past, the ethnicity estimate, the admixture estimate. It's the regions of the world. It's a very wide scope. The recent past is the communities. It's much more narrow. In the case of West Donegal, my community is within 20 miles of each other. And then that's the recent past. And now you bring it on to where most genealogists come back to DNA again and again. And I know that I'm not alone in this. I go and check my DNA results several times a week. Some weeks it might be daily, just to check if I got new matches. And that's what I'm going to talk about this. This is where you're right up to the modern day and you're looking back at the last 200 years to look at the people who you match. So, what does it mean to do cousin matching? What does it mean to be part of the largest genetic network in history? 4 million people have tested. When you take a DNA test, if you take a DNA test, we match your DNA with all the other 4 million people who've taken the test. And we try to identify who would be your siblings, your parents, your cousins, first cousins, second cousins, and so on and so forth. This is a screenshot I took of my results, I think it was last summer. I had 6,550 people who were identified as being related to me. This is all, I checked it this morning, it's 10,900. So there are 10,000 people who are cousins of mine, which means we share an ancestor in the recent time frame. We're talking 8 generations for the autosomal DNA test. So there's 10,000 people out of the 4 million who I know that I'm related to. Obviously that's more than you're ever going to be able to process as a genealogist. Yes. But the trick then is, I have 10,000 people. One of them probably at least, in fact, one of them for sure knows more about that ancestor than I do. And the whole thing about cousin matching is it's about finding the right cousin who can help you with the right answer. So, like I said, 10,000 cousins is what I have now. And no, I haven't talked to all of them. I've talked to maybe 400. I got a nice one in today. It was actually off on a tangent. One of my favourite stories, DNA stories of the last year happened today. And in fact, he doesn't know about it yet, which is kind of funny. Because we had a family tree, we were doing the old-fashioned way. I happened to do some searching, came across a guy in America for a branch of the family I was looking at. The spellings weren't quite the same, but I found a guy who was researching in Florida. He had a family tree, but the names didn't quite match. It was one of those really close ones where you could say, probably is, but we don't have enough to say it definitely is. And he had an Anthony McAna, A-N-A, and the mother was Anne Donald. I had an Anthony McAna, A-N-A-W, the mother was Nancy O'Donnell. We thought, that looks close enough. And we did the math, and we should have been, him and my mother should have been third cousins. And his DNA results came back today. He sent me a mail saying, I got my DNA results, I'm waiting till the weekend to open them with my wife. I couldn't wait. I looked at his DNA results, and it came back that he's actually a third cousin. So we know we have the match. It's another piece of evidence, and that's what you're looking for as a genealogist. More evidence, more evidence, more evidence. So how does that help me? Well, he has a lead on Nancy's parents. So he has another document that he has. He also has, which is phenomenal, he has the family whiskey recipe. I didn't know we had a family whiskey recipe. But he has that piece of paper that Anthony took over with him to America, and they actually have put it in the family box, and he photocopied and sent me. So we have a family whiskey recipe, so that's great. So how do you use cousin matching, which is perhaps the meat and potatoes of what a DNA test does? You got these 10,000 people, and you'll go on to Ancestry and you'll do the test, and they'll come back, it'll be a list. And on each page, it'll say you have 50 cousins, and you go to the next page and the next page for a couple hundred pages. And what you're looking for is people who have information that's useful to you. The first thing that we do at Ancestry is we compare your tree. If you have a tree at Ancestry and you've linked it to your DNA test, and they've linked it to their DNA test, we'll search all the trees to look for surnames that might match. And in fact, with Tom's today, I showed him the gravestone that had Nancy on it, and he updated his Anne to say Nancy because we were pretty confident. And the first thing in the DNA results came back said, we think Nancy's your common ancestor. So that's the first thing that happens. Our ancestry systems will comb all the database, all the trees that are associated with the database, and look for people who have family trees that look like yours. The next kind of things it can do is you can search for a surname. So I could go into, my surname is Mulligan, and it's something I do maybe once a month. I go into the database and I say, give me all my DNA matches whose surname is Mulligan. In fact, it was one of the first things I did when I got my DNA results. The first thing a lot of people do is you go and put in your own surname and see how many people match your surname. Weirdest thing was, the first result of my list was actually a girl who works in the office with me. She sits three desks down, and it turns out her granny is a Mulligan. But we'd never put two and two together. We've since gone and done the old-fashioned genealogy to make the connection. But it's one of those things where you put in a surname, it'll give you back a surname. You can also put in a location. So if you have a particular branch of the family you're working on, you can put in Cork or Galway, and it'll go through all the trees and find out all the people who have family trees in Galway. Now it may not be on the same branch that connects you, but at least it's a lead to follow. So relating this back to like the trip to the archive or going through a record, instead of going through records, what you're using is, you're using your DNA matches as a big net to pull in all the people who you know are related to you, who you know have a common ancestor. And you're using that information to kind of pull it all together and then to search it like you would any other archive or collection. So I treat all my 10,000 people as kind of a special archive. Mm-hmm. It's the archive of people who are related to me. So after you do that, you can actually start to do some much more advanced techniques. And this is kind of a diagram that I drew together of, I had a particular brick wall for Sarah Gallagher, who's my, there it is there, and her mom, it's actually Tom's wife, Tom, who I talked about at the start. She's a Gallagher. Gallagher in Donegal is the very definition of a brick wall. It's like a Murphy or a Kelly. So I had a lot of candidates, I just didn't know which was the right one. And that was the brick wall. It's been kind of staring me in the face for odds on 5 years. And so what I did was, I have a cousin in Birmingham, Martin, and he's also been working on this line quite extensively. And he's had a lot of good, descendancy research done. So I asked Martin, would he take the test? And he did. In fact, his dad took the test as well, and my mum took the test. So we had a couple of us all kind of clubbing together and looking at DNA. And what that DNA showed us to do, we have this other aspect of a DNA test, that when you look at a DNA match, so let's say when I look at Martin or Tom and I look at their match profile, it'll tell me what people in the database match both of us. Mm-hmm. And that leads you to kind of this kind of triangulation effect, where if they match myself and they match Martin, there's a good chance that they're on this branch somewhere. It's highly unlikely that they match me and they match Martin and they're somehow related to my dad. I mean, it's possible, but it's not very likely. So what we did is, when we did the test between us all, we actually came back with 15 matches that matched all 4 of us. And out of those 15 matches, we went to look, and 8 of them had trees. And we went to look in the trees, and we actually found a Gallagher in a couple of trees. And we found Donegal in a couple of trees where they didn't have Gallaghers. So we then went and contacted all of those other 15 people and said, do you know anything about Gallaghers of Donegal, where this is a brick wall we're working on? And there's one particular match, which is a guy in San Diego, Don, and he had this letter, which had been passed down by his granduncle, which was the history of the Gallagher family. And because he was matched with us, all the details were correct, and was able to get us the next step up. And that's never going to be in an archive. That's the kind of stuff, that's like the whiskey recipes. This is the stuff that turns it from a birth or a marriage or death of vitals into real family history. And oddly enough, I was not a big person for descendancy research before I did DNA. I did dabbled, and descendancy research is when you start going down from an ancestor. But now I really enjoy descendancy research. For us as Irish people, this is an unusual aspect that doesn't appear in America or Australia. This is like diaspora research. And on one level, there's an emotional side to it, because you're reaching out, like Tom was a perfect case. The guy that I mentioned today that we found out we were a match. Tom just knew his family came from Ireland. He did not know where. He had an idea it was Donegal. He now has family in Donegal. In fact, which only could work in Ireland, he told me today that he wrote a letter to Mackinac family, Druminin, which is the townland, Ireland. That was it. He wrote that letter, and it got all the way back to the family on the homestead. And they called him at the weekend, and they had a half-hour conversation talking about, on one side, what happened once Anthony went to America, and the other side, well, what happened, the family stayed at home. So that's it's a very strong emotional connection you get out of this. But there's also the extra paper chase that's involved. You know, my tree had gone back to pre-famine on most lines. I was just at all the brick walls you could find. And it had somewhere like 300 people in the tree on it. Now I'm at over almost 2,000 people in my tree, because I keep finding new people to research, finding new parts of the story. And the benefit happens when you find a case like this, when you go down the line and you find out they have a letter in a drawer, or they have an American record which references an immigration route. The New York passenger lists are a perfect example, which they list out parents. And this connects you to somebody, and that connects the dots, and the DNA pulls them in like a special collection, and then you search that collection, you mine that collection with all the same tools and techniques that you use when you're looking through records and archives. So those are the 3 tests. The distant past, the ethnicity estimate, a great gateway for people who are new to it. For most of us in this room who've been doing it for a little longer, it's probably a nice conversation starter. Hey, I'm 70% Irish, I'm 90% Irish. And then somebody starts, well, what does that mean? And you draw them into our web of genealogy. The communities test, it's when it starts getting really useful. It starts to pinpoint very small regions of the world. Like there's 300 regions. My son is half Ukrainian, half Irish. And it can pinpoint regions wherever his genes happen to pick up. We have, a couple of dozen communities in Eastern Europe. We have communities all over the world. So it's not just Irish people who benefit from it, it's all over the world. Irish people were well served. We got 16 communities, which for an island the size of Ireland is actually good going. And then the final one, which is the one you come back to day in, day out, if you're like some of us, where you can go constantly. Like I'm 10,000 cousins right now. I think I'll be at 13,000, 14,000 by the summer. Another maybe 20,000 by Christmas. So it's something you can keep coming back for, keep getting new leads, keep finding new ways to grab brick walls and solve your family history. Thank you very much.